Franklin Civil Roundtable. We are going to have a panel discussion with historian Dave Powell and Battle of Franklin Trust CEO Eric Jacobson, and they're going to talk about
Y'all
the
don't have
Atlanta
like
campaign,
vegetables or anything, do
its
you?
influence on Hood, and the
Bad
Tennessee
fruit?
campaign. So we'll get started here in just a little bit, and thank y'all so much for
Throw it
joining
at
us.
him if you don't like it, not me.
Tune in for our next Civil War Franklin Roundtable on December 14th. Local historian Tom Price is going to talk about Maury County and the Civil War. So, thank y'all for joining us.
I believe that's what we said. I think it was calendar year December 31st. Well, there's really not going to be roundtable memberships. Yeah, well, I mean, you can be a member of the Battle of Franklin Trust, and there's different levels of that. So I think there's a $65 level, $85, $125. I mean, it's for one person, two person, three people. Yeah, yeah. But we're going to keep doing this regardless. Yeah. If you just go to our website and go to the membership page or the donation page, there's all sorts of options for you to give money. We'll take whatever you want to send. All right. Jeff has disappeared, so.
I like your exhibits, by the way.
What's that?
I like your exhibits. You quote several old friends.
Yeah, this has been up for a few months. We're really going to use this a lot more as a conventional museum and exhibit space, because for a long time there were events here, and we shut those down a few years ago. Right. No more weddings, no more social functions. And then, of course, Carter House is going to have a huge exhibit area.
Yeah, I was over there to see the new building.
Did you see the building?
Wow.
Isn't it something?
You must feel very, very happy.
I will be very happy when it's done.
Yep.
But it's really starting to look like a, like a building.
Yeah. So the camera's pretty much focused on the table, so I'll stay at the table.
Yep.
Very excited for
And he'll give us the mic.
Yeah.
No, you got a mic, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm wired up.
So, thank you all so much for coming out for the roundtable today. I think this is going to be a really good discussion, and it's going to be introduced to our speakers today. The gentleman to the right over here is David Powell. He was a graduate of Virginia Military Institute in 1983 with a BA in history. He has published numerous articles in various magazines and more than 15 historical simulations of different battles. For many years, David's focus has been on the epic battle of Chickamauga, and he is nationally recognized for his tours of the important battlefield for publishing 6 books on that campaign, including the Chickamauga Campaign Trilogy, completed in 2016. David has also written on the Battle of Newmarket, co-authored the Tullahoma Campaign with renowned historian Eric Wittenberg, and published The Impulse of Victory, Ulysses S. Grant at Chattanooga. Both the latter 2 books appeared in 2020. His current project is a 5-volume study of the Atlanta Campaign. The Atlanta Campaign, Volume 1, Dalton Cassville, May 1st to the 19th, 1864, was published in July 2024, with Volume 2 following in October of 2025. David and his wife Ann and their 3 bloodhounds live and work in the northwest suburbs of Chicago, Illinois. He is retired and writes full-time. The gentleman to the left is the CEO of the Battle Franklin Trust, Eric Jacobson. You guys have been introduced to him multiple times. He has, of course, written multiple books, including The Cause of the Country, which for me as an interpreter is basically the Bible, essentially. So, we're going to get started, and I'll kind of lead off with a question. Chickamauga was a massive, multi-volume effort. How did your research and writing process for the Atlanta campaign differ from the earlier series?
Well, I don't think it did differ. I began Chickamauga looking at, really I was mostly interested in the strengths of the two armies, regimental numbers, the strengths and losses, and it was for a couple of other projects. And that evolved into a decision to go ahead and write something on the Battle of Chickamauga. And that turned into the Maps of Chickamauga in 2009, and that ultimately led to all the other books, including the 3-volume trilogy. But the focus was always on gathering as much primary source material as I could to flesh out the records. For the Atlanta campaign, that's even more important because the official record, especially on the Confederate side of the story, gets sparser and sparser, weaker and weaker as we go forward. So that studying the campaign in May, we have pretty good Confederate documentation. June, not so much. By the time we get to July and August, the official reports are very sparse. And that's also true on the federal side of the equation, because this is such a long struggle for these men. This is May to September. Many of the officers who commanded their units in battle in May or June or July, for instance, by the time that it comes time to write the reports in September, they're gone, they're wounded, they're sick, they've resigned. And so my focus has always been to bring in as many other primary sources, especially contemporary letters and diary sources, as I can. Which is why I drive my publisher nuts with 60 pages of bibliography. But
He deserves it.
but my philosophy is always it's better to have too much than too little. And so I've always been a little bit obsessive about trying to gather as much material and then, of course, organize it and digest it and read it and try and understand it. So I think the approach is the same. And really I'm writing primarily about the same two armies, so I feel like I'm telling the story of old friends. I know these people. I know many of these people simply because I've worked with their memoirs, letters, diaries, recollections for 20 years now. So that does that answer your question?
Oh, very well, very well.
So Dave and I talked a little bit before about how we were going to run the presentation today, and we thought it would be good to start with, I mean, we're going to use how Atlanta influences the Tennessee campaign, but I think a really great place to start is all the way back to shortly after Joseph Johnston took command of the Army of Tennessee and the proposal by Patrick Cleburne, which certainly made the rounds very quickly, to arm slaves in 1864. So Dave, why don't you open that door for us?
So the Army of Tennessee that I'm going to talk about is obviously has its roots in previous years. It's also, of course, the Army of Tennessee that comes here at the end of the year. But it's not exactly the same army. And that's really what I'm hopefully going to try and develop a little bit, and Eric and I will talk back and forth. The proposal that Cleburne makes in January 1864, 1864, get your years right. The proposal that he makes is somewhat shocking. It also, Joseph Johnston, the commander who's just arrived, he was appointed after much soul searching. He was finally appointed commander of the Army by Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Johnston arrives the end of December. Within days, he receives this proposal on his, or I should say, Cleburne makes this proposal in his headquarters to his gathered officers. I always found it interesting, especially when I started to read the official record, that same day that Cleburne made that proposal, Johnson made a proposal of his own, which was a half measure. If you know, if you're familiar with Claiborne's proposal, it was, let us recruit enslaved people, we'll put them, we'll give them weapons, we'll make them soldiers in exchange for their freedom. And since they're not going to fight unless we also free their families, we'll have to free their families, which is a pretty radical idea for the Confederacy, extremely radical as it turns out. Johnson proposed something different. There were several thousand white soldiers that were detailed for Teamsters support troops, logisticians. In the modern army, they'd be soldiers. But they take away from the men in the ranks, the rifle carriers. So Johnson proposed that we hire slaves to take the place of all these white Teamsters, or these white soldiers. But the radical part of his proposal was that in order to incentivize both the slaves and to do this, and to be faithful, the Confederate government would pay a portion of the wages that would normally go to the slave owner to the slave himself, which had its own sort of radical connotations for the Confederacy. You probably know that Johnson shut down, Johnson forwarded Claiborne's proposal to Davis. Davis shut it down. Johnson's own proposal also went nowhere. The atmosphere had been poisoned. The political climate wouldn't accept any form of emancipation, immediate or gradual. The fire eaters within the Confederate Army, William Henry Talbot Walker, for example, were furious about the idea, and they kind of back-channeled it, took it, sent the word of the proposal to Confederate Congress and also to Davis, complaining about it. And frankly, there were Confederate officers in the Army of Tennessee who immediately thought the Army will come unraveled, the desertion will spike if this proposal gets out. Now, the proposal was never implemented. Word did get out within the Army, and the attitude was generally negative, but since it wasn't going to happen, there was some question about loyalty of Claiborne and some of the other, there were a handful of Confederate officers who supported it semi-officially or semi-quietly. But in the end, the proposal went nowhere. It does sort of frame up an interesting reference about what's the mood in the Army of Tennessee in December 1863 through January 1864. They had won a battle at Chickamauga in September, then they had been badly defeated at Missionary Ridge in November. The longest serving Army commander, Braxton Bragg, had just been replaced after 18 months in command. The mood of the country was pessimistic. 1863 had been a good year for the Union, Gettysburg, the capture of Pemberton's army at Vicksburg, and then the redemption of the defeat at Chickamauga with Missionary Ridge outside of Chattanooga. So, but the Army is resilient. The Army of Tennessee has a couple of different strains in it that I've always found interesting. It's not sustained by high morale and faith in their leadership the way the Army of Northern Virginia, say, is. They're almost their devotion to Robert E. Lee. Trust me, Braxton Bragg does not get devotion. That said, he does have his supporters within the Army. He is not the universally reviled figure that so much of, I just got to laugh by throwing out Braxton Bragg. the Army has his supporters, and they will continue to talk to him throughout the campaign. So, but the men in the ranks are primarily, they have a commitment to the cause, and they have faith in themselves. They know they're good soldiers, they know they're hard fighters. They have a whole series of almost victories under their belt. Perryville and Murfreesboro, for example, are very close to Confederate battle victories. And then they had Chickamauga. They regard Missionary Ridge as a fluke. But underneath that, or perhaps in conflict with that strain of commitment and devotion to the cause, there are many people in the South who aren't really committed to the idea of the Confederacy or secession. One example I like to use is that, yes, Tennessee sent something like 120,000 troops to the South, but they also sent 40,000 people to the North, 40,000 white citizens to the North, not just former slaves who enrolled in the U.S. colored regiments. Kentucky sent equal numbers. Kentucky remained in the Union. Those are just a couple of examples. And then in the mountain regions, Northwest Georgia and East Tennessee are perfect examples of that. There are, as the war goes on and as Confederates implement conscription, there are more and more soldiers that are pressed into the ranks that aren't necessarily happy to be there. And this creates a problem for the Army of Tennessee. It's always had a desertion problem. All Civil War armies have desertion problems. But I'll give you a sense of what's going on in the first 4 months of 1864. When Johnson arrives in December, he has an army of about 45,000 present for duty. And before I get too deep into this, I want to touch a little bit on what the numbers mean, or what the categories mean. In the Confederate Army, they tended to count 3 categories: effectives, present for duty, and aggregate. Effectives meant men in the ranks, not officers, men carrying rifles. So you didn't count your musicians, you didn't count your color bearers, you didn't count any of your officers. So if a regiment took 250 men into battle, 250 effectives into battle, well, they really carried closer to 300 men into battle, because they had somewhere between 15 and 20, 25 officers. Musicians would essentially be the medical people, and even men who were temporarily excused duty would still be with the unit. Present for duty is the closest number the Confederates and the Federals both used. So when I compare numbers, I always like to compare present for duty numbers. Or sometimes you'll see present for duty equipped. And that really means the men and officers in the ranks ready to fight. And then the number that we tend not to think about in Civil War writing, you read Civil War literature because historians want to know how many men were carried into battle. But Civil War generals had to know how many people to feed. And that's the aggregate number with the Army. So when I say Johnson had roughly 45,000 men present for duty in December 1864, his aggregate number, the number of people he was feeding outside at Dalton, were 55,000 people. And in the ensuing 4 months, he's going to build those numbers up to the point where by the beginning of May, he's increased the Army's strength by about 10,000 men. His present for duty number is 55,000 troops. His effectives are 49,000. But as I've just pointed out, I don't like the effectives number. I think it's a number that's too deceptive for our purposes. And And his aggregate number is now 64,000 people. He's feeding 64,000 men at Dalton. His idea, if he can bring slaves and pay them, and to replace many of those extra 9,000 men and put them in the ranks, has some merit, actually. It lacks any political support. So those are quick categories of numbers, but there still is this constant strain of dissatisfaction. And one of the things that I found initially when I was going through the Army of the Cumberland records, the Union Army's records, is I was looking at their provost, monthly provost general's reports. And they would report the number of Confederates captured and the number of Confederates who willingly gave themselves up. And then the third category in those monthly reports is the number of Confederate soldiers captured or deserted who then took the oath. How many of you know what that phrase means, taking the oath? Basically, if you were a Confederate soldier, you surrendered yourself to the Union authorities. The Union very cleverly realized that this was if they just sent everybody to prison camps, both armies had a fear of prison camps, they didn't want to go. But if you as a Confederate soldier raised your hand, took the oath of loyalty to the United States, then you could go north of the Ohio River and be a free man. You were essentially on parole as long as you stayed north of the Ohio. And that proved to be a fairly significant incentive. And so one of the things in January, February, March, and April, the attrition of troops from the Confederate Army of Tennessee that were turned over to Union authorities were about between 1,000 and 1,100 men a month. When you think about that number in terms of combat strength, that's a brigade of infantry a month. That's an entire division of fairly small division as the Army goes, but it's not the smallest division in the Army of Tennessee, that simply walked away from the fighting. And that doesn't count the men who may have walked away and not turned themselves into the Union authorities, but simply gone home to Alabama. So I think the understanding of Tennessee and its motivations, we have these two threads that always run through, and in my writing, as the campaign progresses, you see that quite a bit. In 1860, or I should say in May and June, when General Johnson starts to fall back from Dalton to Resaca and crosses the Oostenaula River and falls back to Cassville, and then crosses the Etowah River into Paulding County and fights at Dallas and New Hope, and ultimately falls back to the Kennesaw line. Each time they fall back, there is a wave of Confederate desertions, especially from those men like the 40th Georgia, 42nd Georgia, Marcellus Stovall's brigade, for instance, which is mostly recruited in those areas. Many of those regiments don't show significant desertion until they walk past their homes and leave them in the hands of the Federal Army. And then the desertions in those regiments start to spike. So I think that I always tried to be cognizant of that in the writing. What are these two dynamic strains? And so that factors in to pretty much all of the decisions that the Army's making, because manpower and the numbers. Let's face it. If you're talking about the Army of Tennessee, if you know anything about John Bell Hood and his memoirs, you know anything about Joseph E. Johnson and his memoirs, honestly, half the page length is fighting about numbers, fighting about casualties, fighting about strengths, how many men were turned over to the Army. And maybe before we get into the numbers debate, we should talk a little bit about the personalities as well. I think the Civil War, the study of the American Civil War, is really driven by our fascination with all these people, with these personalities. You know that Joseph E. Johnson is given command of the Army in December. His underlying philosophy is primarily defensive in nature. Confederate President Jefferson Davis wants him to take the offense. This is a strategic rift that is never going to be resolved the whole time he's in command. He takes command and he's relieved until he's relieved on July 18, 1864, well, really the night of July 17. So six and a half months that he stands in command. Davis constantly expects him to take the offensive. Before the campaign opens in May, Davis, who has appointed Braxton Bragg as his chief advisor, and Bragg's the former Army commander of the Army of Tennessee. Honestly, if anyone should understand the logistical realities of campaigning in Tennessee and North Georgia and the capabilities of the Army of Tennessee, it's Braxton Bragg. He's the longest tenured Army commander. And yet, when Bragg, but Bragg is offensive-minded, and when Davis pushes him, appoints him as his advisor, and then pushes him to help instill this offensive spirit in Davis, Bragg immediately overlooks all the logistical impossibilities that he faced, his own army faced in Tennessee, to immediately insist that the Army could go back into Tennessee without a railroad supply line, across the Tennessee River, across the Cumberland Plateau, right back here to Franklin and Nashville, right back into Middle Tennessee, take the war back north in some sort of grand offensive. And I'm totally on Joe Johnson's side here. When I've looked at the logistical aspects, the shortages of wagons, the shortages of transportation, I don't have to tell, you know, when I talk to groups in Ohio or the East Coast and we talk about terrain, I don't think they have an understanding of really what the Cumberland Plateau but here in Middle Tennessee, I think everybody knows that in the 1850s and 60s, it was called the Barrens. It didn't supply the food and the grazing to sustain an army moving over it. You had to haul your own supplies. And Johnson simply doesn't have those transportation assets. He tells it would take hundreds more wagons and thousands more horses and mules to even put together a logistical capacity. That might be something that you've studied for John Bell Hood's much smaller army, which is operating on a logistical shoestring up here.
Right, and his logistics are so different because he's having to draw his supplies from a much narrower location, which for this campaign turns out to be basically central and southern Alabama and maybe a little bit of southwestern Georgia. But I thought the personalities is a good lead into actually what happens over those few months in the middle, and then we can transition to this campaign, because Hood is clearly not of the same mindset as Johnston when it comes to fighting. I think everybody knows you have a defensive leaning person versus an offensive leaning person. I think both often get a little bit of short thrift for being too aggressive or not being aggressive enough. But what happens is that inevitably the Army of Tennessee is sitting outside Atlanta. And Davis wants to know what Johnston's going to do to protect or save the city. And we talked earlier, either Johnston didn't have a plan, or if he didn't have a plan, he was just ridiculously stubborn and wouldn't tell Davis what the plan was. And so what happens is he is relieved and John Bell Hood is placed in command.
Yeah, Johnson, well, at least some people in Johnson's headquarters believe that any information that they fed to Davis would immediately become public knowledge. Not that Davis would, telegraph the Federal Army, but it would work its way very quickly into the newspapers, and Johnson's plans would be upset. But Hood is fully committed to the offense. Hood, in his memoirs, Advance and Retreat, says, I was of the school of Lee and Jackson. They were, his corps commanders in the Army of Tennessee. And I also think that Hood has his low points and his high points. He's not to be universally and completely reviled, but he does say something in his memoirs that always really bothered me. He thought the Army of Tennessee had lost the offensive spirit, and they wouldn't attack. Well, I think we're sitting in a place that disproves that real quickly. But let's talk a little bit about that relationship between Hood and Johnson. When Hood is recovered from his wounds and arrives at the end of February in Dalton, he's been tapped as a corps commander. James Longstreet, Braxton Bragg, Joseph E. Johnson, and a host of other people in the Confederacy all agree that John Bell Hood should be a lieutenant general and a corps commander. That might be unprecedented in the Confederacy, that everybody agrees. And yet, they're all happy to have him. Johnson says he is much wanted here. He arrives, he takes command of the corps that's being temporarily commanded by Thomas C. Heineman. And Johnson immediately relies on him. Johnson relies on him much more than his veteran corps commander, William J. Hardee. He relies so much so that Hardee feels snubbed and feels like, Johnson won't listen to me. He always listens to Hood. At one point in the campaign, Hardee says to his wife, he writes home and he says, I came to Army headquarters and I found Hood and Johnson planning strategy, and from what I can see, Hood is doing most of it. So Johnson turns to Hood as his offensive puncher. If he's going to try and launch an attack, if he contemplates an offensive move at Dalton, it goes to Hood. When he tries an attack at Resaca, it's Hood's corps that makes the attack. When he tries, fails, but attempts to launch an attack at Cassville that falls apart for a variety of reasons, it's Hood's corps. And Hood is always suggesting offensive concepts. Let me go attack, let me do this. At New Hope Church, after Pickett's Mill at the end of May, Johnson lets Hood attempt a flank march, a Stonewall Jackson style flank march. It fails. It doesn't, when they get to a point to launch an attack, they see that the Federals are entrenched and they decide not to attack. The Battle of Kolb's Farm on June 22, when Johnson transfers Hood's corps from one flank, the right flank, to the left flank, and he attacks Joseph Hooker's 20th Corps. That's an offensive concept that's initiated by Hood, and Johnson agrees. So that's who Johnson counts on. Hood has been widely accused of holding a secret correspondence with Jefferson Davis. Well, he did. So did a lot of other generals in the Army of Tennessee. Joe Wheeler frequently wrote to Braxton Bragg going, boy, Johnson just won't let me do what I need to do.
Can I jump in? This is an interesting part of this whole personality, politicking, backstabbing, self-absorbed thought process, and it is so interesting to everybody, it seems, in the Civil War community has heard that John Bell Hood sent some communiques or letters or whatever to Jefferson Davis. And there are very few who ever know that there was a whole grouping of other officers doing the exact same thing and almost saying some of the exact, putting forth some of the same concerns. And why do you think it is that Hood, is it just because he was Hood and he was really the most well-known and well-respected at the time, or?
Well, I think it has to do mostly with hindsight, the fact that it's Hood who replaces Joe Johnson, and Johnson feels stabbed in the back much more so than say he does from Hardee, who's also corresponding with Bragg and a little bit with President Davis, but or Joe Wheeler. So, but the fact that both end up as Army commanders, and then both accuse each other of sabotaging them, because Hood's memoirs are all about correcting Johnson's lies, and Hood's not entirely wrong there. Johnson plays fast and loose with the truth in a number of locations. So he becomes the special focus of that anger and that frustration.
So what happens when Joe Johnston is exited stage left and Hood takes over? As someone who follows Dave's regular updates on volume, whichever volume it is, you've been writing about Peachtree Creek and you're headed toward Atlanta. So talk a little bit about, we know Hood's offensive oriented, so Hood comes out swinging. So what happens, especially at Peachtree Creek in Atlanta, and then we'll get into Tennessee.
Well, Johnson told Davis when Davis finally had enough, and he asked Davis, "I must know your plans. What are your plans to defend Atlanta?" And Johnson gives him some vague, well, I'll let Sherman come forward, and when the moment's right, I'll attack him. And if that doesn't work, we'll fall back into Atlanta. I'll let the militia hold Atlanta, and I'll operate on his flanks. Very, very vague directions. He does talk to the Army about having a plan to attack the Federal Army as it crosses Peachtree Creek, which flows into the Chattahoochee just north of Atlanta, and he doesn't have any specifics, but as I will point out in Volume 3, one of the primary reasons he doesn't have any specifics is that there aren't any Federals on the other side of Peachtree Creek to attack on July 17 or even July 18. So he can't have a specific plan to attack nobody. He needs to know where the Federals are going to be. Now that's different by the time Hood takes command on the 18th and lays out a plan initially for attack on July 19, and then that gets delayed because the Federals are slow crossing the river or crossing the creek, and so the attack finally comes off on July 20. But as you might expect from a brand new Corps commander who's just been elevated to Army command, things don't go all that smoothly. Peachtree Creek famously is supposed to happen at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The two Confederate Infantry Corps under Hardee and newly promoted A.P. Stewart are to attack George Thomas, the Army of the Cumberland, primarily falling on initially primarily falling on the Union 14th Corps. But Hood and really General Wheeler, who's the Confederate cavalry commander, have lost track of an entire other Union army, which is the Army of the Tennessee, which moves into Decatur, Georgia, just east of Atlanta on July 20. And so now Hood is attempting, when he finds out about this, he's attempting to extend his right flank and bend it back so that he can cover the back door, the eastern door basically to Atlanta. And so he turns to his old corps, now commanded by a guy named Frank Cheatham, to shift. And in order to cover the hole that will create, he's stretching out Cheatham's corps very dramatically. He's just going to have the other two corps shift over a half a division front, roughly a half mile, a mile total. But that turns out not to be the case. They go much further, a mile and a half to 2 miles, depending on exactly where you put those spots on the ground. And the attack doesn't go off until 4 o'clock. Peachtree Creek would have been a shattering Confederate defeat had Joe Hooker not helped out by when General Hooker, the Union 20th Corps commander, crosses the creek. He's very lax about letting his troops rest and not entrench and not prepare proper defenses. They had time to prepare those defenses, they just didn't do it. So that now, by shifting over, the Confederate attack, the Hardee's Corps primarily falls against one Union division in the 4th Corps and gets repulsed fairly handily. Hardee also does not do well in this battle. But A.P. Stewart hits the 20th Corps and finds them unprepared, and so he has some success, not great success. He doesn't rout anybody. He doesn't win a battlefield victory. As a matter of fact, Peachtree Creek is largely regarded as a Confederate defeat, though many of the Army of Tennessee at the time thought they had beaten back the Federals. But they also suffer pretty heavily in casualties, 2,500 to 3,000 men. And so a large part of that problem, or a large part of the disjointed effort that is Peachtree Creek, which is mostly a series of brigade assaults, is because of this confusion in the Army, the shifting of troops, what amounts to poor staff work at Army headquarters. Hood still has Johnson's chief of staff, William Makel. In theory, he has the Army staff working for him. One of the things that's been hard to determine is how much of his own staff did he take to Army headquarters as opposed to leaving with Frank Cheatham, who is a division commander promoted out of a different corps, Hardee's Corps. So armies aren't just drawing organizational charts on paper or reorganizing companies on a whiteboard. Armies are teams, and they need to build some sort of team effort. Hood just doesn't have that time. The real question is what happens on July 22 and what happens on July 28, and certainly that's the Battle of Atlanta on the 22nd and Ezra Church on July 28, and then the Battle of Jonesboro on August 30, September 1. Through that whole period, we see that the Army just doesn't maneuver well, or as well as it did under Johnson. Johnson may have been too defensive oriented, too quick to retreat, but every retreat he made was relatively faultless in terms of execution. The troops left on time, notable large quantities of supplies were not abandoned. The Army moved to the right places at the right times. That's going to be not the case for the Army under Hood. The planning doesn't quite work. The machine doesn't fit together. On July 22, General Hardee is ordered to march, another Stonewall Jackson move at Chancellorsville. That turns out to be a further march than anybody planned. The terrain is terrible, and so it takes what Hood expected to be a dawn attack doesn't happen until afternoon, between 12 and 1 o'clock. at Jonesboro on July 28. Another brand new player into the game, S.D. Lee, has arrived from Mississippi, and he takes command. He replaces Frank Cheatham in place of Hood's old corps. And S.D. Lee is given the authority. Hood wants to try another flank attack using the Lickskillet Road. When they get there, they find a Union Corps, the 15th Corps, in their way, and so S.D. Lee launches a series of attacks that also don't go very well. We're moving very quickly through pieces of the Atlanta campaign, but I hope you get the sense that the process isn't as effective as it was under Johnson. Now, would Johnson have done better in those attacks? Well, would he have made those attacks? We can't answer that. I have my doubts, but by and large, Hood's aggression does not translate into effective offensive action. There's some tactical success, further belying the idea that the Army of Tennessee isn't going to assault breastworks. They do assault breastworks and take some pretty heavy losses, and even achieve some successes. They break through the Union 15th Corps, not on July 28, but on July 22. They capture some federal artillery. It's only a desperate Union counterattack that restores the line.
Killed James McPherson.
They did indeed.
Yeah.
So I don't think the problem is tactical. I don't think the problem is a morale problem within the ranks of the Army, that the troops just won't fight. I think the problem is at the higher echelons.
So, because we pretty much promised to not keep everyone here captive for more than an hour, I thought we'd transition to what this means about where we are at. And then I think Jeff has a question, and we can certainly answer a few here. I find this fascinating because I think this is this. You know, if you've ever, although the battlefields around Atlanta are very much lost, you can follow the flow of the action, especially Peachtree Creek and Atlanta. That sort of, I guess, southeastern part of Atlanta. I mean, you can follow it. You can find out where Hardee's Corps was and where General McPherson was killed. I mean, you can follow it just like you can here in Franklin.
Probably the unheralded historian of the American Civil War is a guy named Wilbur Kurtz.
Yes.
Who all his work is at the Atlanta History Center. He was a great historian in Atlanta, and was consultant on Gone with the Wind, and all of those historical markers, and hundreds of them,
yes,
to the Atlanta campaign, all through North Georgia and around Atlanta, are his work. And identifying locations, writing the text.
And so much, and the interstates that were built through Atlanta destroyed so much of the battlefield, just like the interstates that were built through Nashville. I mean, they just wrecked parts of it that could not be replaced. But that gets us to, Hood's decision with the, tacit support of Davis to try and drag it out. And this is something that anybody who's followed what we do and certainly been on a tour with me or heard me talk, I don't know what else Hood really logistically could do other than just give up after the fall of Atlanta. So the numbers we talked about, just to try and make things as simple as possible, Johnston has probably north of 60,000 men when in mid-May when he is relieved, there are about 45,000 or so in the Army. The attacks that Hood launches, especially July 22nd, are extraordinarily costly. So he has a little bit more than 30,000 when he sets out toward Tennessee. Unlike these very complex maneuvers at Peachtree Creek in Atlanta, I think everyone sees that Franklin is very straightforward. The enemy's there, and we're going to hit him, and we're going to hit him as hard as we can. But that was on the heels of November 29th and Spring Hill, which was extraordinarily complex, and the same issues that Dave just described are all over November 29th. I mean, it's just stamped all over it. Different personalities, the inability of these subordinate commanders who were in that army long before Hood ever came around, and frankly, before Johnston ever came around. There is a mindset within the Army of Tennessee that it's not that it never existed in the Eastern Army, it's just that Robert E. Lee cleaned it out. If you weren't with the program, you were gone. And the Army of Tennessee goes through a variety of commanders, but you were talking about what's his name, is it Makel?
Makel.
Well, A.P. Mason, who is with Cheatham, eventually ends up with Hood because Makel, I guess, either...
Makel stays about a week and then joins his boss, Johnson.
He and Hood, I don't think, saw eye to eye. But A.P. Mason, there was a reason A.P. Mason had ended up out west, because I don't think he'd done a terribly good job out east. And a lot of the problems that you see on November 29th are the same old issues with the Army of Tennessee. And Frank Cheatham's now back in Corps Command. And Spring Hill was him never really getting his three divisions to work in concert, and he's treating them almost independent of one another. He's actually kind of micromanaging them. They never get moving. Of course, the Federal Army escapes that night. And the one thing in a presentation like this that we don't cover is all of the bad management or poor decisions or poor execution on the part of the Confederates. There's always what the other side was doing. And the Federals always seem to be able to take advantage, which is what you should do, of every mistake and every opening the Confederates gave them. Whether that was at Dalton, at New Hope Church, whether that was at Peachtree Creek or Atlanta, there was always, and then Spring Hill. But Franklin is different. And Franklin is, you know, it's the culmination now of 3.5 years. I think Hood, having seen how the Army had operated, he was not going to leave anything to chance. I don't know what other options he might have had. Right. But any question that he had about the Army's esprit de corps, even he admitted, it's one of the poorest points of his memoirs, where he criticizes the men, but then compliments them for what they did at Franklin. Because no matter who you were, there was no doubting the Army's tenacious nature. I think one thing that Hood did instinctively understand isn't just offense, but it's that offense breeds an idea and a feeling, which Lee and Jackson, especially Lee, you want to fight, right? You don't want to back up and take the easy road. You want to fight. I was just the other day, for some reason, I had to remind myself of how great Ken Burns' series is for the most part, all these years later. And there's a moment when Lee attacks Grant, and of course, in the wilderness, and everybody's freaking out on the Federal side. And Grant just basically says, you know, all you want to do is talk about Bobby Lee. What are we going to do? Yeah. And Grant did the same thing. He instilled in his men this idea that no matter what the setback is, we're going that way. We're not going that way. We're going that way. And there were Confederates, even who survived Franklin, who wrote about the fact that, to use a sort of modern vernacular, they left it all on the table. After having fought from Shiloh through Murfreesboro to Atlanta and come all the way back into Tennessee at Franklin, they understood the casualties were high. They did, better than any of us could. But many of them also understood that that was the price that probably had to be paid. that they were committed to see it to the end. And Hood's interesting. You know, Johnston, you're right. Johnston's memoirs and Hood's memoirs are this like two titanic, either egos or ego and a hurt ego, or a defensive one and a pompous one, and they're just fighting. Here's Hood's book. You know, it's worth a read. But what's interesting is these two men, I don't think, just ever really saw war the same way. And it is so interesting. This, I'll finish with this. The point you made about Johnston, I think, was confiding in Hood because he needed somebody like that who was willing to put the bit in his mouth and go.
He was looking for an offensive weapon.
Yep, and it just turned out that when that one had to go, and if you're Jeff Davis, and just for fun, just pretend you're Jeff Davis for 5 minutes, who are you going to pick? Because I'm sure that, you know, there are some names that pop around out there, but we talked about before, if you're talking about West Pointer with the resume, with the success, Hood makes sense. He really does. To me, he makes as much sense as putting Johnston in command after the Bragg and Missionary Ridge debacle. Davis, he's looking at Johnston going, I don't really want to have to do this, but you know what? He'll fix things. He'll get things in working order. He just then never seemed to get it moving.
Well, if you're looking for someone who carries your philosophy, the philosophy of the offense, you're going to need a guy like Hood. And they're just, by that stage of the war, Hood is kind of your logical choice.
Yeah.
I want to make one final point about the numbers because I think this is always surprising. I mentioned that Johnson has 55,000 men at Dalton before, and that's before Leonidas Polk arrives with the troops from Mississippi and the reinforcements from the Gulf Coast and some other places. By the end of May, beginning of June, the Army of Tennessee has present for duty combat troops somewhere between 75 and 80,000 men, depending on the exact day. The numbers fluctuate because of casualties, obviously, and disease. When Polk is ordered to reinforce to Johnson from Mississippi, he is ordered by Bragg to take what forces you think you can spare. Polk believes he can spare all of his infantry and about a quarter of his cavalry. It takes a cavalry division, arguably the best cavalry division in the department. All told, if you combine that with the reinforcements coming from the Gulf Coast and some from Savannah and places, he gets another 20 to arguably 25,000 troops as reinforcements come to Joe Johnson. By the end of May, Bragg is now arguing with General Polk. Why did you take so many troops? If Polk had not taken those troops, we wouldn't be talking about the Atlantic campaign. Mm-hmm. We would be talking about Johnson's catastrophic defeat in perhaps May of 1864. So another, I don't know, name that carries a lot of weight and not good weight in Civil War, Leonidas Polk, really makes one of the best decisions, best military decisions of his career when he understands the need and reinforces Johnson.
Till he didn't run fast enough at Pine
Well,
Mountain.
there is that.
So Jeff, I think you had a question which is really for Dave, and then we can take a couple from the audience.
Yeah, so do you think Hood's post-war memoir, Advance and Retreat, has helped or hindered our understanding of his decisions?
Look at him before you answer.
Well, both, actually, because for example, let's take the Cassville incident, May 19. Johnson and Hood will argue very strongly post-war. Johnson says he has this master plan. Then Hood doesn't want to, tries to attack. It doesn't work. He doesn't want to fight. Hood counsels retreat. so you have to read both memoirs, and one of the things you walk away from for Hood is that his memoir and his report are probably much more truthful than Joseph Johnson's version of what happened at Cassville on May 19, which Albert Castell has called one of the most significant bad days of the Army of Tennessee. But by the same token, or to carry that further, Hood also spends a lot of time arguing that Johnson, when he handed over the Army in Johnson's memoir, he says, well, I only lost 10,000 guys for the first 7 weeks of the campaign. We know that to be complete nonsense. He lost closer to 23,000 people, because when he said those 10,000 troops, he was counting only the killed and wounded that he knew about. He wasn't counting the cavalry casualties. He didn't count the desertions or the disease. Hood lost 20,000 men. Hood turns out to be right. I actually found in the Western Reserve Historical Society a report dated, I think it's June or July 27, that talks about the casualties to date. No, I'm sorry, June 27, talks about the casualties to date. And it adds up to 26,000 men. Some of those are going to be replaced as men come back. So really what we need to bear in mind is not raw numbers, but net losses, because there's always returning sick and wounded.
Right.
So Johnson's very deceptive there. And yet Hood is increasingly defensive, perhaps once he takes Army command. He denigrates the men in the ranks of the Army of Tennessee. He accuses the leadership of lack of morale, lack of offensive spirit. Perhaps the same weight that settled on Johnson when he was trying to justify his tenure in command settles on Hood. And so I find the further you go into his memoirs, the less reliable you can trust them.
But if you haven't read them and you want to somewhat punish yourself, you should read both. They are to understand, this period of time. I think they're must reads. I mean, so is Sherman's though, because you could sort of jam his in between. But there's also the official records, which is just filled with much of the stuff that they omitted. So we've got time for a few questions. Anyone have one? Right up front. Yes, sir.
I had a couple, I guess. One, do you give much credence to the notion that Davis viewed the Atlanta campaign in the same light as the Peninsula campaign when Johnson retreated all the way back to Richmond until Lee comes
Yes,
in?
I think that weighed on his mind
Okay.
as Johnson retreated further and further.
Right.
In the first 2 weeks of the campaign, Johnson gave up half the distance between Chattanooga and Atlanta. Adairsville, Georgia, is the halfway point on the Western Atlantic Railroad. And when Johnson retreats across the Etowah River south of Adairsville, Davis is shocked to learn that he's done so, because Davis thought he was still fighting further north at Resaca and on the Oostanoola River. So now he's not only given up one river, he's given up two in the space of a couple of weeks. Yes, I think the 7 days, the peninsular retreat bugs Davis.
I guess that's an utterly different issue, but you talked about those Georgia troops deserting as they went down. How many Tennessee troops, after the Nashville disaster, were willing to walk back out of Tennessee at that point? I mean, surely they lost thousands. Does anyone know
That would be in your wheelhouse more than mine.
You mean in the Tennessee campaign? Or the...
Yeah, after the Battle of Nashville, the retreat, it looked like Tennessee soldiers were just peeled off.
Well, I can tell you that when they got to North Mississippi after Nashville, there are several accounts that when they got the orders to go east, because they end up in North Carolina, that many of the Tennesseans, the Mississippians, and the Texans just walked away. The Carolina and Georgia guys, some Florida guys, they at least felt they were headed toward home. Sumner Cunningham, who famously edited and published Confederate Veterans, said that many of the Tennesseans took French leave. They just quit.
My numbers may be off, but I believe that Hood got back into Mississippi with 19,000 men?
He did. This is where numbers are interesting. He actually had it was a touch north of 20, but I found something when I was working on my first book that you have to wonder, like, if someone was really that it was poorly researched or if it was done with intent. Wiley Sword, when he wrote his book, had actually counted the 3,800 federal wounded who were found in Franklin. Well, those wounded became prisoners, so he counted it as 7,600 casualties. And I was like, oh, no, you can't do that. It's still only 3,800 men, but that was where I think Sword actually said he only had like 14,000. And when Beauregard actually compiled a report, and there was a little north of 20,000, but still, Hood had lost a third of his army. And I don't think there were 10,000 when they got to the Carolinas. The Army had been reduced to the size basically of 2 or 3 divisions.
The Army sort of split in half. A detachment was sent to Mobile, maybe 5,000 men. And then the figures I've heard for A.P. Stewart at Bentonville, commanding the last remnant of the Army of Tennessee, is 5,000.
Yeah.
So, you know, retreats out of Tennessee, he's down into 20. By April, he's down to 10.
I think, do you have a question in the back? Someone had a question in the back? Walter.
Yeah, this isn't really maybe in your wheelhouse, but I bet you come across this somewhere. This is related to something pretty close to home. When the Federals came into Franklin on the 30th, the wagon bridge was not there. Based upon my research, it was there in mid-November, about washed out. The Federals, there seemed to be plenty of Federals in Franklin the second half of November too, to rebuild that. That would have perhaps changed the whole complexion of the Battle of Franklin. Do you have any insight into why the Federals, given an opportunity, didn't rebuild a bridge, have it ready for the Federals?
No, I don't. I mean, that bridge, so there are 2 bridges. The railroad bridge was running traffic heavy all through November. So that was the bridge they planked early. That's the one they worked on first. They got that planked. So they had, T.J. Wood's division was north of the Harpeth River by probably 10 o'clock in the morning. The other bridge, we know it was destroyed early in the war, but I think what was in place was this sort of localized bridge for traffic that may have been washed out, as you said, in mid-November. But I don't know, maybe nobody was really paying attention because most of the troops that were moving through Franklin were on the railroad cars. They weren't moving up and down Columbia Pike at any point until November 30th. Garrison in Franklin, I believe, all I've ever found that was in Franklin was the 75th Pennsylvania. And they had a few companies in Granger, but they had a company down on the railroad down on West Harpeth, midway between Thompson Station and Franklin, that got captured on the morning of November 30th. They were sitting in a blockhouse. So I don't think there were more than a couple of hundred guys, and most of them were just kind of hanging around Granger, which itself wasn't really maintained. I just don't think that other bridge ever really was on anyone's radar, because I don't think they were ever expecting Schofield's 30,000 men to show up, that morning.
Desperately needing a bridge.
Desperately needing a bridge.
And no pontoons there.
Well, and that's a whole, Schofield later complaining about the pontoons is so ridiculous because he had pontoons, he'd burned them in Columbia. So he can't blame Thomas for not sending the pontoons because Thomas must have been thinking, well, what are you talking about? I gave you pontoons. But yeah, they were lit on fire on the Duck River days before. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you think there's any validity to putting the number of desertions between Vicksburg falling and Atlanta, that some of the people from especially the Tennessee area had quit and left north or just gone home, and that's why you had the dedication at the Battle of Franklin? Is those were the ones who were left, the non-dedicated had gone? away.
We talked a little about that.
Yeah. I think that for all of the discussion of desertion and everything, by the time Atlanta falls and Hood embarks on the North Georgia campaign and then across northern Alabama, fights at Decatur, Alabama, he's really operating with a core of the committed in the Army of Tennessee. They're the people who are willing to make that last gasp effort, and they're going to go to the bitter end. Now, maybe for many of them, the bitter end happened at Nashville, not necessarily Appomattox or Bennett Station, but let's put it this way: there were guys who fought at Nashville, escaped Nashville, and surrendered at Bennett Station in North Carolina.
Yeah.
That's a pretty arduous 4-month journey.
Yeah, those guys to go to Nashville and get knocked around like they did on the first day, it's always been remarkable to me that some of them withstood the second day's pounding. But when that collapse occurred, there's about 5,000 of them that just stopped. They just dropped their rifles. And I understand that. I would have been gone before that. But you know, that's about a third of the fighting force on the ground that day. They just stopped. And the rest of them made their way south, and like we mentioned earlier, then some of them were like, okay, now I'm done. One of the most famous of all Confederates deserted after Nashville, Sam Watkins.
Yep.
He didn't make it to the end. He quit.
Yeah.
He ended up in Memphis taking the loyalty oath. Boy, you tell that to some people, it'll like telling them Santa Claus isn't real.
He did leave that part out of his book.
Yes, he did. But you know what Watkins does in his book? He never says he was in North Carolina. He just says the Army surrendered in North Carolina.
That's true.
But Sam knew. I mean, and there were thousands of guys like him. And of course, you know, through that weather at that state, I mean, it could have been a nice summer day. I think some of them were just like, listen, is this worth dying for anymore? I can see why guys quit. That's why they were peeling off Lee's army from Petersburg to Appomattox. I mean, they were just breaking off everywhere.
Lee left Petersburg with north of 50,000 men. He surrendered what, 30, 29?
Yeah.
And change. So now some of those are captured, Sailor's Creek, et cetera.
right.
But clearly by that stage of the war, if not at Nashville, but certainly by that stage of the war, the armies are disintegrating.
I think that's a great place to end. I want to thank y'all so much for coming out and discussing that. I thoroughly enjoyed it myself. I hope you guys did as well. You're more than welcome to, if I think Dave Powell has some books that you can purchase. I'm sure he'd be willing to sign them for you as well. We also have some used books for $5, which is a really good deal, so definitely check those out as well. And you can bring those up at the gift shop as well. So thank y'all so much for coming out. We really do appreciate it. Come back for the next one next month, December 14th. Tom Price will come and talk about Maury County and the Civil War. So thank y'all again so much.
Dave, good stuff.
Thank you.
You got your check, right?